A community is rocked when an ambitious young woman is found dead in a hotel room.
She had been shot in the back of the head.
She was executed in cold blood.
Things don't happen like that in the town of Charlotte.
At first glance, the suspect list is long.
She was actually a correctional officer.
She was very serious about her job.
Is this tied into her job? I got a feeling that was the case.
But as the investigation unfolds, suspicions shift.
Maybe his wife had gotten wind of this relationship.
You're the only person that can tell me what happened.
She was playing both of them.
If he can't have her, then no one could.
And her killer has no intention of facing justice.
He was not going back to jail.
There were over 100 guns in his home.
He wanted to go out with a blaze of glory.
All the games from the beginning.
July 20th, 2020. It's Monday morning in Navassa, North Carolina. A small town just across the Cape Fear River from Wilmington.
It's a relatively small community in Brunswick County.
Population with about 2,000 to 3,000 people.
It's 95% African American, about 3% white and 2% Hispanic. But most of all, Navassa was a really nice place to live.
But this morning, one Navassa native, 23-year-old Kiana Graham, has gone missing.
Kiana worked as a correctional officer at the Pender Correctional Institution.
She was scheduled to work a mandatory overtime shift the night before.
But her mother gets a call saying that Kiana didn't come to work.
She was a newer employee, but she was a good employee.
The girl was always punctual, always on time, always where she's supposed to be.
This was very rare for her not to show up to work.
When Kiana's worried mother calls her, she gets no response.
This is Kiana, call me back.
Hey, Kiana, why are you not picking up the phone?
Kiana lived with her mother. They were always in touch. And when she wasn't at work, she always picked up her phone.
This is just out of her habit, just to disappear and not let her mother know where she was.
A voice in the back of her head is telling her that something is terribly wrong.
Kiana was a young female working at this facility.
Her mother always had it in her head that working at a prison like this wasn't safe.
So she was nervous and she called the police to try to help her locate her daughter.
I need to file a missing persons report.
To everyone who knew her, Kiana Graham was a bright light.
She was a free spirit, easygoing, just loved people.
She was very likable, just a nice, giving, and caring person.
She and her mother were extremely close.
She was greatly loved.
She was very family-oriented.
And she was highly focused. After graduating high school, Kiana entered the workforce.
She worked at this home to help people with mental disabilities.
She was an avid worker.
But as much as she loved her job, it wasn't paying the bills.
She was living with her mom because cost of living is very high.
To gain her independence, Kiana knew she needed a better paying job.
She was taking classes to become a correction officer.
After completing her training, Kiana landed a great position at the Pender Correctional Institution.
She was really excited about being a corrections officer, getting a steady job.
She was a great employee and she was a hard worker.
She had a bright future ahead of her.
But as secure as her work life seemed, Kiana's love life was more of a work in progress.
Kiana had been with Xavion Marshall in a long-term on-again and off-again relationship since high school. for 23-year-olds. It's not abnormal to have an on and off again relationship, but there was no evidence that there was a lack of love there.
At the same time, Kiana struck up a friendship with an older local man named Michael Hill.
Michael was in his 50s, Kiana was in her early 20s.
He played a role as a mentor in her life, often giving her advice.
Which wasn't surprising, given that Mike was a pillar of the community.
He was pretty well known since he had grown up in Brunswick County.
He lived a good life. He had a good job.
And then a few years ago, he hit the lottery, literally.
He was actually known in the community as Money Mike since he won $10 million off of a scratch-off ticket.
But Michael's newfound wealth didn't fundamentally change his character.
All he ever wanted was a fishing boat and a pickup truck, and he did buy that for himself.
He spent $200,000 paying off his home.
But he had spent everything else on the community. He had bought four-wheelers for kids in his neighborhood, bought vehicles for people. He gave some to the church.
He was known to be very philanthropic and give back.
Kiana respected his strong values and shared an interest in his laid-back lifestyle.
She enjoyed doing the simple things with him.
Well, they go fishing, they go hunting.
As the two grew closer, Kiana also counted on Michael for relationship advice.
It just really feels like he's always playing games.
He probably is.
She would often lean on Michael for advice with Xavion.
Some men are like that. But not all of us, though.
Then one day, when Kiana and Xavion were on a break, her relationship with Michael took an unexpected turn.
They started an intimate relationship.
They really enjoyed each other's company, so they just kind of kept with it.
But now, Kiana's mother has called police to report her missing.
Hey, I'm Chief Howell. I went out to Miss Graham's house and talked to Miss Graham about her daughter.
She told him that she received the phone call from her job. That's when she began to worry.
For her not to show up, that was very alarming.
And she was not answering her phone.
She knew this was not normal. Her mother said she never hardly missed work unless she was like deathly ill. She was thinking something happened to Kiana, that she wasn't just missing.
Well, why do you think that?
She's a correction officer.
She was working in a facility that housed criminals. Her focus was that someone in the facility could possibly do her harm.
And Chief Howell is thinking the exact same thing.
Is this tied into her job? Is she missing because somebody she had in prison had come and kidnapped her? I got a feeling that was the case.
"23-year-old Kiana Graham was enjoying spending time with 52-year-old lottery winner Michael Hill.
There was a very big age gap between the two of them, but Kiana was very much so into Michael.
Kiana really enjoyed doing the simple things with him.
But now, Kiana's mother has reported her missing, and police fear the worst.
She was a correction officer.
That type of position, it lends itself to being in harm's way.
One of the inmates, originally under Kiana's supervision, could have gotten out and targeted her for revenge, money, or in a sexual crime.
Concerned, Chief Howell immediately tries to locate this young woman.
Let me make a call.
I did a missing person report, and I had the sheriff's office try to ping her phone. The phone was not on.
Given that Kiana is in law enforcement, the stakes are high. So Chief Howell calls in the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation.
I said, look, guys, I need your help. I got this missing girl. She's a correction officer. She just vanished off the face of the earth. And they said, okay, we'll come down and assist you.
In the meantime, Kiana's mother fills the chief in on Kiana's plans the day before.
We start talking about a guy she'd been dating, Mike Hill.
Mom knew Michael Hill from the community and had seen him with Kiana. She knew that there was some type of relationship there.
She said she was supposed to meet him the previous afternoon before work.
My captain was good friends with Mike, and Mike would come stop by the PD sometime to see him, and that's how I met Mike. I didn't know him good enough to know that he was dating Kiana, but he seemed to be a nice guy, seemed to be personable.
Well, did you talk to him before you realized Kiana was missing?
Yes.
Kiana's mother called him.
Have you talked to her?
She called asking him if he had seen Kiana.
She's not answering it.
Michael told her mother that he didn't know what was going on or where she was.
But Michael Hill isn't the only man in Kiana's life.
Kiana was in an on-again, off-again relationship since high school with Xavion.
Police need to talk to both men. Michael can't be reached, so the chief makes a call to Xavion.
But they gotta run her through all the questions and really get to the bottom of the situation.
When asked if he knew where Kiana could be, he says no.
I talked to Xavion on the phone that morning. He said he hadn't seen her or talked to her.
While the investigator may harbor doubts about his story, the case is about to take a tragic turn.
I was still doing follow-ups.
But then, the chief gets a call from dispatch.
This is Chief Howell.
But they had found a deceased female in a hotel in Charlotte.
And she was face down on the bed in a pool of blood.
When looking at the ID, they were able to identify the body as Kiana.
Okay, thank you.
Chief Howell is charged with the difficult task of breaking the news to Kiana's mother.
We told her that her daughter had been found and was deceased.
She was devastated. That's her little girl, and she's gone now.
I really felt bad for her. Her mother's really, really good, nice people. Kiana was too.
The Navassa police chief remains with Kiana's mother, while a Charlotte detective and North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation agent begin their examination of the crime scene.
Kiana was found in bed with her head face down.
It was pretty chilling just the way she was laying there.
You could clearly see that there was a large hole in the back of her head.
She had been shot, and it appeared she was asleep or falling asleep and likely didn't see it coming. It was basically like an execution.
When they turn her over, a .45 projectile comes out of her mouth.
But there was no gun at the scene. It seemed that she had been deceased for a while.
One thing found inside the room points to a potential suspect.
Along with Kiana's ID, there was a second ID with a name, Xavion Marshall.
That's when Chief Howell arrives at the scene.
He shares some information with them.
Kiana's mother had told him more about her boyfriend, Michael Hill.
Michael Hill isn't just Kiana's boyfriend.
He is currently married as well.
Police in Charlotte, North Carolina have only begun to investigate the complicated murder case of 23-year-old Kiana Graham.
At first, Police thought she had been targeted because of her job as a correction officer. But now, they aren't so sure.
Check this out.
Inside her hotel room, they found the driver's license of a man named Xavier Marshall.
Chief Howe, who had questioned Kiana's mother, was able to tell them that he was an on-again, off-again boyfriend of Kiana's. But that isn't all. He also reveals that Kiana was dating a man named Michael Hill.
Which immediately leads police to consider a possible motive.
There might have been a love triangle.
But the plot thickens because Michael is also a married man.
Did Michael's wife find out about his affair and relationship with Kiana? Did she want revenge?
Investigators hope requesting the hotel surveillance footage will provide some answers.
The hotel had a video system.
They were pulling all of the surveillance footage to see if anyone came in and out of the room.
In the meantime, police confirm the hotel room was registered to Michael Hill.
At this point, it is now their #1 priority to find Michael Hill.
As police try to locate him, news of the murder spreads through Charlotte.
It's a small community, low crime area. People are close. That murder really shook the town of Charlotte.
So as soon as detectives track Michael down, they bring him in for questioning.
He was calm and cool.
They started by asking him about his relationship with Kiana.
They want him to paint a picture of what their relationship was like.
He's just a straight shooter. He just owns up to it, totally.
Her and Mr. Hill had an ongoing, on and off again romantic relationship.
How long you guys been off and on now?
About a year and a half.
Yeah.
Year and a half.
The affair actually started when he and his wife, Jackie, were going through tough times.
Michael describes his relationship with Kiana as a breath of fresh air.
She was a really nice person. He said that they enjoyed doing many things together and just living a simple life.
And he said that she was one of the few people in his life who didn't want to run his pockets.
Sound like you really loved her.
Yeah, I love her.
The investigators wonder if Kiana felt the same way.
She swore down she was in love with me.
Though Michael admits one thing made him doubt the sincerity of Kiana's feelings: her relationship with Xavier Marshall.
She would only reach out, according to Michael, when she was on the outs with Xavier.
Have they been on the outs recently?
Yeah, they be. The whole reason we even got together this particular time, but she was like, I might give him a chance. I'm like, why would you even go running back to this guy for 6 years since high school? But then she'd be like, he get on my nerves.
And even then, she never completely cut Xavier off.
Kiana was still communicating with Xavier, chatting on and off again through social media platforms,
which caused a lot of the tension with Mr. Hill.
He just got really, really tired of it.
After that, I was like, man, you love that guy. You might as well just go ahead and do it.
Finally, Michael says he gave Kiana an ultimatum.
It was coming to a point where it's like, listen, you are my lady. And this other guy, Xavier, he needs to get out of the picture.
But Michael says Kiana refused to commit. So 3 weeks ago, he'd ended the relationship.
Sound like Kiana just didn't know what she wanted.
Kiana, it's a mixed bag because I don't know if she know what she wants.
He couldn't deal with it anymore.
That's it, I'm done.
After that, Michael claims he had no contact with Kiana until Sunday.
She texted him saying that she missed him and she really wanted to see him. And he told her that they could get together the next day.
According to Michael, he agreed to make a reservation for them at a hotel.
This was something that they often did.
You check in around 10:30, then you go wait in the parking lot. She shows up around 11:30. You guys go in.
They'd meet up and just enjoyed each other.
Michael said he stayed with Kiana as long as he could, but when he left, she stayed at the hotel.
Her plan was to get some shut-eye before she had to go to work that night.
So detectives need to determine what time Michael left the hotel.
Yesterday about, I want to say about 2-something. About 2-something yesterday.
And he says that when he left, Kiana was alive and well.
Michael said he didn't know that anything was wrong until he got a phone call from Kiana's mother asking where her daughter was.
Michael is taken aback because Kiana said she was going to go to sleep and go to work.
Once again, he told Kiana's mother that he had no idea where she was.
But it wasn't long after that he received a call from a friend with shocking news.
From who? This friend of mine called me and said, man, do you realize that they found Kiana dead?
Who do you think could have done this?
I don't know, man. I don't know, man.
Did you kill her, Mom?
I didn't kill her.
In fact, he insists investigators are barking up the wrong tree.
Michael explains the guy you probably want to be talking to is Xavion. Kiana had told him he was crazy.
In Charlotte, North Carolina, Michael Hill, the boyfriend of murder victim Kiana Graham, has told police she was afraid of the other man she was seeing, Xavion Marshall.
On one particular occasion, she contacted Michael to let him know that she was concerned because Xavion was stalking her.
And he asked Kiana, do you need me to come and handle this situation, come get you? She's like, no.
I'm on the phone with her. I said, listen, man. I said, I can call somebody. She said, no. I said, do you want me to come over there? She said, no, it don't make things worse.
But Michael says that recently, things had worsened between Kiana and Xavion.
And he says just days earlier, Xavion wouldn't let her out of the car during the argument.
He said Kiana actually had to call the police on Xavion.
Week before last, she called me. She said, you know, I called the police on the other day, right? Because he wouldn't let me out my car. I said, what?
Could Xavion have followed Kiana to the hotel and killed her?
Maybe Xavion found out about Kiana and Michael and came to the hotel and in a jealous rage, killed her.
There is already evidence Xavion may have been there.
They found Xavion's ID in her purse.
And he could have easily learned she was there for a tryst with Michael.
Does he own any guns or?
The country boy. Everybody owns guns.
He said Xavion, being a country boy, he carried weapons just like himself.
But investigators can't be sure Michael is telling the truth about Xavion.
Maybe Michael's wife has gotten wind of this relationship. Maybe she is the one who committed this crime.
Does she know anything about that?
He immediately cuts them off.
Michael informed the officers that his wife didn't know about Kiana.
He was sure that she had nothing to do with this.
But detectives wonder, was Michael's wife as in the dark as he claimed?
Police have to do their job.
Investigators go to the home Michael shares with his wife Jackie to question her.
Hi, can I help you?
She told them that she knew Kiana from around town, but didn't know her personally.
And Jackie definitely didn't know that her husband was sleeping with her.
Excuse me?
She said she knew absolutely nothing about the relationship between Michael and Kiana.
She is completely just blown away at this news that her husband is cheating on her. And as well, this situation involves his mistress being murdered.
And with that,
thank you for your time.
She has no motive to be the perpetrator of this crime.
Detectives were able to rule out Jackie.
But before police can make their next move, a friend of Kiana's named Carol comes forward with what might be a break in the case.
She says, look, if anybody is doing any stalking, it wasn't Xavion, it was Michael.
She says that Michael often threatened Kiana.
And she even heard Michael say, if I can't have you, nobody can.
In Charlotte, North Carolina, a friend of Kiana Graham's has just told detectives that Kiana had an abusive relationship with Michael Hill.
It was a textbook domestic violence relationship. He was manipulative, he was jealous.
He became pretty much a control freak over this young woman.
He bought her clothes that he wanted her to wear. He wanted to know where she was, who her friends were, and where she went.
Oftentimes, Kiana would ignore his calls, but he found some way to contact her. He would call from other numbers.
He was physically stalking this woman.
And what Carol tells police wasn't just hearsay. Michael had come after her and Kiana's other friends, too.
We tried to get them to break up.
When her friends were encouraging her to walk away from the relationship, Michael would often threaten the friend group, and she oftentimes saw Michael with a gun.
There were times when Carol had also heard Michael directly threaten Kiana.
He said he was going to kill her if she didn't leave her boyfriend.
But Carol admits she never saw nor heard Kiana complain of physical abuse.
This case was an important domestic violence case because it wasn't physical abuse that led to Kiana's death. It was emotional.
That's very dangerous. When they're controlling your every move, you have an issue.
And when investigators are finally able to review the security footage from the hotel, they are all but certain Michael is her killer.
They were able to see Michael on camera.
He was the only person who came in and out of that room before Miss Graham was found.
With probable cause, detectives get a warrant for his arrest.
They also get a search warrant to check out his house.
Michael isn't there, but his wife lets police inside.
She was very helpful, but you could really see in her face that she could not believe that Mike had killed Kiana.
Inside, detectives find an arsenal of guns belonging to Michael.
They found over 100 guns.
More confident than ever, detectives use cell phone tracking data to pinpoint their suspect's location.
They tracked his phone to Southport. He was at the waterfront.
Worried he could be armed and dangerous, investigators employ a secret weapon. Chief Deputy Charlie Miller.
He knew Mr. Hill from the community.
They grew up together, actually several houses down from each other.
He actually approached Mr. Hill first since he knew him.
I'm sorry, man, but you're under arrest.
He doesn't resist, he doesn't give him any problems, he lets them take him on in.
We are very grateful that he is the one that found him.
Especially because inside Michael's truck, there's evidence this could have ended differently.
He had several firearms loaded at the time.
One was a pistol and one was the assault rifle.
We believe that he was planning suicide by a cop.
Continuing our coverage tonight.
News of the arrest shakes this small community.
When people started learning about what happened to her, there was a lot of people that were really upset and having a hard time with this.
For him to kill her because he was jealous and had no control over her at that point was horrific.
Face to face with detectives, Michael continues to insist on his innocence.
He still denies it. He says he didn't kill Kiana.
That's when investigators confront him with the video evidence against him.
They say, look, you're the only person we see who had gone in and out of that room.
You're the only person that can tell me what happened in that room to the woman you love.
His whole demeanor changed.
Mr. Hill sort of put his head down and sighed and then began to tell the truth of what actually happened.
You expect things to change, and then you wake up, figure it all out, all the games from the beginning.
Michael resented Kiana. He was willing to walk away from his wife, who was a loving woman, to be with her.
And I really fell in love with her. I fell in love with her. But she wasn't in love with nobody. Really? Yeah.
She was telling him that she was in love with him. Yet he would oftentimes find her communicating with Xavion in his presence.
He was very jealous. He felt like Kiana was playing him.
And though Michael previously told police Kiana wasn't after his money, he now claimed she was.
How much money you think you spending tomorrow? A lot. A whole lot.
Of course, without Kiana there to defend herself, and with Michael suddenly changing his story to paint her as a gold digger, we can't know what the real truth is.
But Michael makes it clear that the day of the murder, his resentment against Kiana for continuing the relationship with Xavion boiled over.
He got upset because she was talking with him on her phone. They had a few words about it.
That's really none of your business.
The hell it ain't.
She told him they were finished talking about him, and told him she was going to lay down and go to sleep. She had to go to work at 6 o'clock.
Michael was angry and he was hurt.
He was beginning to unravel at this point.
I got up, I said, I'm going to smoke a cigar. So whatever, just make sure you cut the lights off. I don't know, I guess just touch something in it. I reached down in my book bag, pulled out the 45, reached over to the shower.
"52-year-old lottery winner Michael Hill has just confessed to shooting his 23-year-old girlfriend, Kiana Graham, in a jealous rage over her talking to her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Xavion Marshall.
He got upset because he felt like she was talking with him. Then she was going to sleep and told him to turn the lights off. He pulled out the 45 that he had in his bag and he shot her in the back of the head.
She did not have an opportunity to fight back.
She never saw it coming.
Did you check to see she was dead? I didn't even look at her. I didn't look.
He grabbed his things and he walked out of the hotel room.
Fleeing the scene, Michael was sure he'd be stopped.
There were people in the hallway. However, they must not have heard the noise or thought it was something else.
Michael says he immediately went to dispose of the gun.
Where'd you throw it at again?
Down in the river.
He went down a dirt road in Navassa and threw the gun into the Cape Fear River there.
After that, Michael says he couldn't face going home.
He said he drove around.
And he spent the night in his truck.
Then he hatched a plan.
Michael explains he had been in prison before.
In the 80s and 90s, he had been convicted of some property crimes and a robbery.
I'm not going back to prison. So I can't live in prison.
So he went and bought firearms as part of his suicide by cop plan.
He was planning to jump out of his vehicle with a firearm and pray that the police would shoot and kill him. But when he saw Charlie Miller, he said he couldn't do that to his friend and gave up without incident.
It could have been a much worse situation. We were very grateful that it ended the way it did.
Continuing to build their case against Michael, investigators try to locate the murder weapon.
Brunswick County Sheriff's Office come out and assist with a dive team. Those deputies and those officers dove 3 or 4, maybe even 5 times trying to locate the firearm.
But they were unable to locate it.
On July 21st, 2020, Michael is charged with first-degree murder.
An element of first-degree murder is that there has to be premeditation.
Michael claims that he killed Kiana in the heat of the moment. It wasn't planned, but premeditated murder is not just the act of planning it out, but also thinking about it.
Michael Hill in the past said that he was going to kill her if she didn't leave her boyfriend.
So the prosecutor in this situation believed that first-degree murder was appropriate.
With Michael behind bars, the community mourns Kiana's loss.
There was a lot of love and support for Kiana. She had a good-sized funeral.
As the case moves to trial, Michael surprises everyone by enlisting a public defender.
It was a shock given that he won the lottery in 2017.
He won $10 million.
Once taxes are taken out of it, it's more than $4 million.
He had actually spent a lot of that money, and he gave a lot of it away.
Though Michael hopes to negotiate a plea, prosecutors insist on taking the case to trial.
We believe that was the appropriate thing to do because essentially Kiana was executed in cold blood, and we did not feel he deserved anything less than life.
In May of 2022, when Michael's trial opens in a Brunswick County courtroom, it opens old wounds for Kiana's family.
Her family was present at the trial. Trials are always difficult for victims of homicide. They have to hear all the evidence of how the homicide occurred. That can be extremely difficult.
In front of the jury, the prosecution paints Kiana's murder as a classic case of domestic violence.
Michael was very possessive, and this was a woman he wanted to completely control. And if he could not, he was going to kill her, and that's what he did.
Though Michael may not have initially planned Kiana's murder that day, he made a conscious decision to kill her after an alleged betrayal.
They had got into an argument. She wouldn't leave her boyfriend, and he said he just got fed up and shot her.
To prove Michael's guilt, the prosecution presents overwhelming evidence.
They first called Kiana's friend Carol to the stand.
She talked about her relationship with Mr. Hill, how he was controlling, how he was jealous, how they were concerned for her safety, and he had threatened to kill her at one point. We watched surveillance footage where they discovered Mr. Hill was the only one who went in and out of that room. And then we subsequently interviewed him for several hours about what had happened. And he had confessed to the entire homicide.
Given the facts, It's no surprise when the jury returns with a guilty verdict.
He was found guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Although Kiana's family is satisfied with the verdict, no punishment will ever be enough.
There's really no justice that can bring back the life of an individual.
There are murders that shock a town for a week, murders that dominate the newspapers for a month, and then there are murders that refuse to disappear. They remain buried beneath ordinary life, beneath new buildings, beneath changing faces, beneath decades of birthdays, weddings, funerals, and forgotten headlines. The murder of Samantha Eastman was supposed to become one of those cases. A name in an old file, a photograph in a cardboard box, a question nobody expected to answer. But 20 years after the night she vanished, investigators would reopen the case, and what they discovered would force them to look at the original evidence in an entirely different way. The first emergency call came just after dawn. A vehicle had been found abandoned near a lonely stretch of Minnesota road. The engine was cold. The driver's door was slightly open. One interior light was still glowing. There was no sign of a struggle outside. No broken glass. No overturned vehicle. No obvious explanation for why someone would simply leave a car there before sunrise. Then investigators discovered the identification. Samantha Eastman, 29 years old. A flight attendant. Someone who is accustomed to airports, unfamiliar cities, hotel rooms, departure boards, and constantly changing schedules. Someone whose life was built around movement. Someone who could disappear for hours because disappearing was part of the job. That detail would matter enormously. Because when Samantha failed to arrive where she was expected, nobody immediately thought murder. They thought delay. They thought a missed flight. They thought a dead phone battery. They thought she had changed plans. They thought she would call. She never did. Samantha had been working in aviation long enough for people around her to understand that her schedule could be unpredictable. She might leave before sunrise. She might return after midnight. She might spend a night away without warning. Her coworkers knew not to panic over a few unanswered messages. But this time was different. Her silence continued. Hours became a day. Then another. And somewhere inside the routine of an ordinary Minnesota morning, a family realized that something was terribly wrong. Samantha was gone. The first officers who examined the abandoned vehicle did not know they were standing at the beginning of a case that would consume investigators for decades. They saw a car. They saw personal belongings. They saw the ordinary debris of a life interrupted. There was nothing cinematic about it. No blood-soaked scene.
No obvious weapon. No handwritten confession.
No witness pointing toward a suspect. Just absence. And absence can be one of the most difficult things for investigators to solve. The first question was simple. Where had Samantha gone? The second was harder. Who had seen her last? Her movements were reconstructed piece by piece. Phone calls. Work records. Travel information. Messages. People who remembered seeing her. People who thought they remembered seeing her. People who were certain of what they had seen until detectives asked them to place it on a timeline. Every minute mattered. Every contradiction mattered. And every ordinary detail suddenly became suspicious. The investigation moved quickly during those first days. Detectives interviewed coworkers, friends, neighbors, people who had spoken with Samantha shortly before she disappeared. They searched locations connected to her routine. They examined the vehicle. They looked for fingerprints, fibers, trace evidence, anything that might explain how a young woman could vanish without leaving behind a clear trail. But the case refused to cooperate. There were possibilities everywhere. Certainties nowhere. Someone had taken Samantha's life. But who?
And why?
That question would become the central mystery. There was no obvious motive, no confirmed stalker, no known enemy, no public threat, no dramatic confrontation that anyone could identify. Samantha had lived a life that appeared, from the outside, remarkably ordinary. That made her death more frightening. Because if she had been targeted, investigators needed to understand why. And if the killer had chosen her at random, then something even more disturbing was possible. Perhaps anyone could have been the victim. The first major search began under a gray Minnesota sky. Officers moved through wooded areas and roadside spaces. They examined ditches, drainage areas, remote stretches of land, places where someone could leave evidence without being immediately noticed. Search teams walked slowly, step by step. Every object became important. A piece of fabric, a discarded container, a shoe print, a cigarette, a broken branch. Most of it meant nothing. That is the brutal reality of a homicide investigation. For every meaningful clue, there can be hundreds of objects that look important and lead nowhere. Days passed. Then weeks. The media began reporting the disappearance. The photograph of Samantha appeared in newspapers and on television. Her face became familiar to people who had never met her. A young woman looking directly into the camera. A professional smile. A face frozen in time. The public wanted answers. Her family wanted Samantha home. Investigators wanted a break. Instead, they received silence. Then came the first strange lead. A witness claimed to have seen Samantha shortly before her disappearance. The sighting seemed plausible. The description appeared to match. The location fit. The timing was possible. But when detectives reconstructed the witness's account against Samantha's known movements, something did not fit. The time. A small discrepancy. Only minutes. But minutes can destroy an alibi. They can create one too. Investigators returned to the witness. The story changed slightly. Then changed again. The witness insisted there was no deception. Only confusion. A memory becoming distorted under pressure. The lead was eventually downgraded. But the uncertainty remained. Someone had apparently seen Samantha. Or believed they had. That distinction would haunt the case. Then came another lead. A vehicle. A vehicle reportedly seen near a location connected to Samantha. The description was vague. Dark color. Older model. Possible damage to one side. But thousands of vehicles matched the description. Police searched records. They interviewed owners. They tried to determine whether the vehicle had any connection to Samantha. Nothing conclusive emerged. The investigation began to spread outward. More interviews. More searches. More dead ends. And slowly, the case began to cool. That phrase would eventually become associated with Samantha's name. Cold case. At first, nobody used it. Detectives were still working. Evidence was still being reviewed. Leads were still coming in. But time changes everything. Witnesses forget. People move. Buildings disappear. Businesses close. Technology changes. Telephone records vanish. Paper records are destroyed. And memories that once seemed precise become uncertain. The case remained open. But it was no longer moving. Then something happened that nobody expected. A piece of evidence from the original investigation was placed into storage. It would remain there for years. Nobody knew that the answer might already be inside the file. Nobody knew that the future would eventually give investigators a technology the original detectives did not possess. And nobody knew that one day, more than 2 decades after Samantha disappeared, someone would open that old evidence box again. The killer had lived with the secret for 20 years. 20 years of ordinary mornings. 20 years of grocery stores and traffic lights. 20 years of birthdays. 20 years of conversations. 20 years of watching the world move forward while Samantha's family remained trapped in the same unanswered question. What happened to her? And somewhere in that 20-year silence was a detail so small that the original investigators could not recognize its importance. Not because they had failed. Not because they had ignored the evidence. But because forensic science had not yet caught up with the crime. The old case file had been closed. The evidence had not. And when the investigation finally returned to Samantha Eastman, it would begin with something almost invisible. Something that had been there from the beginning. Something the killer had never realized he left behind. And that was the first sign that this case was not dead. It had only been waiting. For more than 20 years, that evidence remained almost invisible. It was not the kind of clue investigators dream about. There was no confession hidden inside it. No name.
No photograph.
No message written in blood. Nothing that immediately pointed toward a killer. It was simply a small item recovered during the original investigation, cataloged, sealed, and stored with hundreds of other pieces of evidence from a case that had slowly disappeared from public attention. To the detectives who first handled Samantha Eastman's murder, it had been one more object among many. Something worth preserving, but not something that appeared capable of solving a homicide. Then technology changed. Laboratories changed. DNA testing changed. And suddenly, an object that had once seemed meaningless could speak. The case was reopened quietly. There was no dramatic announcement. No cameras waiting outside the police station. No press conference. Just a small investigative team sitting around a table with an old case file spread across it. The photographs were faded. The paper had yellowed. Some of the original reports were typed on machines that had long disappeared from police departments. Names appeared repeatedly. Some belonged to people who had moved away. Some belonged to people who had died. Some belonged to witnesses who could no longer remember the events clearly. The detectives began where every cold case investigator begins. At the beginning. They reconstructed Samantha's final known movements. They studied the timeline again. Not the timeline remembered by newspapers. Not the timeline repeated in documentaries. The original timeline. Minute by minute. Who had spoken to Samantha? Who had seen her? Where had she been? What was she carrying? What was missing? What had investigators overlooked? The first surprise was not a new clue. It was a contradiction. A small contradiction buried inside an old report. One investigator had written that Samantha's vehicle appeared to have been abandoned shortly before sunrise. Another report placed the vehicle there considerably earlier. The difference was not enormous, but it mattered. If the second estimate was correct, then the window in which Samantha disappeared was wider than investigators had originally believed. That changed the list of possible witnesses. It changed the significance of certain phone records. It changed the importance of a location that detectives had previously considered only briefly. The case suddenly had more room. And more room meant more possibilities. The team returned to Samantha's personal life. They looked at friendships, professional relationships, former acquaintances, people she had dated, people who had become distant, people whose names appeared only once in the original file. This was one of the most difficult parts of the investigation. After 2 decades, investigators could not simply assume that the person who looked suspicious in an old report was still suspicious today.
People change.
Relationships change. Lives change. A person who had been 25 at the time of the murder might now be approaching 50. Someone who once lived 5 minutes from the crime scene could now live in another state. Someone who had lied during an interview might have lied because they were frightened, embarrassed, or protecting someone. Or because they were guilty. The investigators had to separate suspicion from evidence. They returned to the people who had originally been questioned. Some agreed to speak. Some refused. One former acquaintance remembered Samantha differently than investigators expected. He described her as careful, organized, not reckless. She was someone who usually told people where she was going. That detail conflicted with the idea that she had simply disappeared voluntarily. Another person remembered a conversation Samantha had shortly before her death. The memory was vague, but one phrase stood out. Samantha had apparently told someone that she had become uncomfortable around a particular person. The original investigators had heard the statement. It had been documented. But they had never been able to establish exactly who she meant. Was it fear? Annoyance? A misunderstanding? Or something more serious? The reopened investigation searched for that person's identity. At first, several possibilities emerged. Then one name appeared repeatedly. A man who had been loosely connected to Samantha's social circle. He had never been charged. He had never been publicly identified as a suspect. He had given investigators an interview years earlier. And, according to the old notes, his answers had appeared cooperative. He had provided a timeline. He had explained where he had been. He had denied seeing Samantha that night. The original detectives had checked parts of his story. Nothing immediately disproved it. So his name faded into the background. Now, 20 years later, investigators looked again. The man was older. His life was different. He had moved. He had changed jobs. He had built a family. From the outside, there was nothing extraordinary about him. That made the discovery even more unsettling. The detectives requested permission to compare his current DNA profile with the unidentified biological material recovered from the original evidence. The request was not treated as a dramatic breakthrough. At first, it was routine. There was no guarantee of a match. The biological material could have belonged to someone innocent. It could have been contaminated. It could have degraded. It could have contained too little usable DNA. The laboratory technicians began the process. Days passed. Then the result arrived. It was not a complete answer. It was a partial profile. But it was enough to change the direction of the investigation. The unidentified DNA did not immediately prove that the man had killed Samantha. It did something more important. It placed him closer to the physical evidence than he had previously admitted. Investigators now had a problem. A real one. They had a person who had denied contact. They had evidence suggesting contact. And they had 20 years of distance between the two. The detectives did not confront him immediately. They watched. They reviewed. They tested. They examined every statement he had given in the original investigation. The old interview was played again. His voice came through the recording with the flatness of another era. The detective asked where he had been. He answered. The detective asked whether he had seen Samantha. He said no. The detective asked whether he had ever been inside her vehicle. Again, no. That answer suddenly mattered. Because the new forensic evidence suggested that he had been in contact with something connected to Samantha. The investigators needed more. They began examining the man's movements around the time of the murder. The original alibi had never been independently verified in full. That had not been unusual. Cold cases are filled with incomplete alibis. A friend remembers. A co-worker confirms part of a story. A receipt appears to support another part. The pieces seem sufficient. But now the detectives had a reason to question every piece. They contacted the people who had supported his original account. One had died. Another could not remember. a third still remembered. But when the detective asked the same question 20 years later, the answer was different. The man had not been where the suspect claimed he had been. He had been somewhere else. Not far away, but somewhere else. That single discrepancy reopened an entire section of the timeline. The suspect's story began to fracture. Not dramatically. Not all at once. One detail at a time. He had said he never knew Samantha well. Investigators found evidence suggesting otherwise. He had said he had never been inside her vehicle. The forensic evidence contradicted that. He had said he had no reason to contact her. Phone records from the period suggested repeated communication. Each discovery was small. Together, they formed a pattern. The investigators now believe Samantha may have known her killer. That possibility changed the emotional center of the case. For years, the murder had been viewed as a terrifying mystery involving an unknown predator. Now, investigators were considering something different. Samantha may have trusted the person who ultimately killed her. She may have agreed to meet him. She may have entered a vehicle willingly. She may have believed she was simply having a conversation. And that possibility explained something investigators had never fully understood. There had been no obvious struggle at the beginning. No chaotic scene. No desperate attempt to escape. If the killer had been someone Samantha knew, then the absence of obvious resistance suddenly made sense. But the detectives still did not know what had happened inside that vehicle. They did not know where Samantha had died. They did not know where her body had been taken. They did not know whether one person was responsible. And most importantly, they still needed to prove that the man whose name had resurfaced after 20 years was not simply someone who had crossed paths with Samantha. The investigation could not be built on coincidence. It needed evidence. The team returned to the original search areas. They examined maps, old aerial photographs, property records, road construction plans, places that had existed in the early years of the investigation but no longer looked the same. One location caught their attention. A piece of land that had once been isolated was now surrounded by development. Houses stood where fields had been. A road had been widened. Trees had been removed. Drainage systems had been rebuilt. The landscape had changed so completely that investigators wondered whether something had been hidden there for decades without anyone realizing it. They searched the historical maps again. The location was close enough to Samantha's known movements to matter. But proximity was not proof. The detectives needed a reason to search. Then an old witness statement provided one. The witness had reported hearing a vehicle in the area on the night Samantha disappeared. The detail had seemed insignificant. At the time, there were countless vehicles on the roads. But the witness had remembered something else. The vehicle had stopped. The engine had remained running. Then, after several minutes, it had left. The original investigator had written the detail down. Nothing more had happened. Now, the cold case team looked at that sentence differently. They compared it with the suspect's known vehicle. They checked historical registration records. They examined photographs. They studied the timing. The vehicle was not conclusively identified, but it was consistent. And suddenly, the investigation had reached a dangerous point. The suspect was no longer just a name from an old interview. He was connected to forensic evidence. His alibi contained contradictions. His relationship with Samantha appeared more significant than he had admitted. And a historical witness account placed a potentially matching vehicle near an area relevant to the disappearance. Still, the detectives waited. Because one wrong move could destroy the case. If they confronted him too early, he could lawyer up. He could refuse cooperation. He could destroy evidence. He could change his story. The investigators needed one final piece. Something that could connect the man not merely to Samantha, but to the moment when her life ended. And that answer was hidden in the same old evidence box. The tiny piece of evidence that had survived 20 years was about to be tested again. This time, the laboratory would not search for one person. It would search for a relationship. A second DNA contributor. A trace that might reveal whether Samantha had been physically restrained, whether someone had handled the object, whether the killer had left behind biological material without ever realizing it. The technicians processed the sample again. The first result had been unexpected. The second result was worse. Because this time, the laboratory found something that should not have been there. A mixture. Two people. One was consistent with Samantha. The other was unknown. But the unknown profile contained enough genetic information to make investigators stop. They compared it against the suspect. The result was not an immediate identification, but it was consistent with him. Now the case had moved beyond suspicion. It had entered a new phase. The detectives had a name. They had forensic evidence. They had contradictions. They had a timeline that was beginning to close. And they had one question left. Why would a man spend 20 years denying that he had ever been close to Samantha Eastman if the evidence suggested otherwise? The answer would come from an interview conducted decades after the original one. And this time, the detectives would not begin by asking whether he knew Samantha. They would ask a different question. They would ask him why he lied. The room was quiet when he entered. He was no longer the young man investigators remembered. His hair was gray. His face had changed. His voice was slower. But when the detective placed the old photograph of Samantha on the table, something changed. For the first time in 20 years, the past was sitting directly in front of him. And the detectives were about to find out whether he could continue living inside the story he had created. He stared at the photograph for several seconds. He did not touch it. He did not ask why the detectives had brought it into the room. He simply looked at Samantha Eastman's face, preserved in a photograph taken when 20 years had not yet passed between a missing person report and a homicide investigation. The detective sitting across from him said nothing. Silence was deliberate. It gave the man time to fill the room with his own thoughts. Eventually, he looked away. The first question was simple. Did you know Samantha? He answered yes. It was the first significant change from his original statement. 20 years earlier, he had described the relationship as distant, casual, almost non-existent. Now he admitted they had known each other. The detective did not react. Were you with her the night she disappeared? A pause. Then another denial.
No.
The detective opened a folder. Inside were copies of the original interview. The man's own words. The old statement was read back to him slowly. He had said he had never seen Samantha that evening. He had said he had no reason to meet her. He had said he had not been inside her vehicle. Now the detective placed the forensic report beside the statement. The man looked at it. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then he asked what the evidence meant. The detective explained. A biological trace recovered during the original investigation was consistent with him. Not proof by itself. Not the entire case. But significant. The man's expression changed.
He leaned back.
His first response was not anger. It was disbelief. Then came the explanation. He said the evidence could have been transferred. He said he had known Samantha. He said perhaps they had touched the same objects at some point. He suggested contamination. The detectives expected that. They had prepared for it. So they showed him something else. The timeline. Phone records. Historical records. Witness statements. And finally, the contradiction in his alibi. One by one, the pieces were placed on the table. He watched them accumulate. The interview lasted hours. There were no dramatic confessions.
No shouting. no sudden breakdown.
Instead, the story changed gradually. First, he admitted seeing Samantha. Then, he admitted speaking with her. Then, he admitted being near the vehicle. Then, he said they had argued. But he continued to deny killing her. The detectives asked what the argument was about. He refused to answer. They asked whether Samantha had been afraid. He said no. They asked whether she had threatened to tell anyone something. He said no. Then the detective asked the question that changed everything. Why did you lie about knowing her? The man stared at the table. His answer was almost inaudible. Because I knew nobody would believe me. That sentence created another problem. What did he mean? The detective pushed further. He said Samantha had been angry. He said she wanted something from him. He said he had become afraid that their relationship would be exposed. But he still would not say what happened next. The investigators now had enough information to reconstruct part of the night. Samantha had met him. They had talked. An argument had followed. Something happened inside the vehicle. And afterward, Samantha disappeared. But the critical moment remained hidden. The detectives asked where she was. He refused to answer. They asked whether she had been alive when he last saw her. Another pause. Then he said yes. But investigators did not believe him. The forensic evidence suggested a violent encounter. The old scene contained details that had never made sense. And the man's changing account had introduced something new. Fear. Not fear of Samantha. Fear of being discovered. The detectives asked what he had done after the argument. He said he drove away. Alone. They asked whether Samantha came with him. He said no. They asked whether she was alive. He repeated the answer. Yes. But when investigators confronted him with evidence that appeared inconsistent with that claim, he stopped talking. His attorney advised him not to answer further questions. The interview ended. But the investigation did not. The detectives now had enough to seek additional warrants. They searched property connected to the suspect. They examined storage areas.
Vehicles.
Old containers. Tools. Clothing. Documents. Anything that might preserve evidence from the period when Samantha disappeared. Most of what they found was irrelevant. But one item stood out. A piece of equipment that had been stored for years. Its condition had changed. Its original surface was worn. Yet technicians believed it might contain microscopic traces. The laboratory tested it. The result was inconclusive. Then another test produced a partial DNA profile. Again, the same unexpected connection appeared. The investigators now believed they had something far stronger than coincidence. But the case still had one enormous weakness. Where was Samantha? Without recovering her remains, prosecutors would face an extraordinarily difficult task. The detectives knew that. The suspect knew it too. For 20 years, the absence of a body had been one of the strongest barriers protecting whoever was responsible. Without Samantha's remains, the precise cause of death could not be established. Without a definitive crime scene, the prosecution would have to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. That did not make the case impossible, but it made it harder. The investigators returned to the historical maps. They marked every location connected to the suspect. Every residence. Every workplace. Every property. Every route he could have taken. They compared those locations with the original search areas. Then they found something. A place that had never been searched thoroughly. Not because investigators had ignored it. Because the land had been inaccessible at the time. A private parcel. Overgrown. Remote. The ownership had changed several times. The landscape had changed. And the original maps showed a feature that no longer existed: a small access road. The road had disappeared decades earlier. But in the year Samantha vanished, it connected the main highway to an isolated section of land. Investigators calculated the driving distance from the place where Samantha was last known to have been seen to the abandoned vehicle to the remote parcel. The route was possible. More than possible. It was efficient. The detectives obtained permission to search. Ground-penetrating equipment was brought in. Search teams moved slowly across the property. The weather was cold. The trees were dense. Every few feet, instruments were checked. Most anomalies were natural. Roots. Rocks. Old debris. Then the equipment produced a reading that was different. A rectangular disturbance. Several feet below the surface. The team stopped. They marked the location. Digging began. At first, there was only soil, then darker earth, then something artificial, a fragment. Investigators carefully exposed it. It was not a human remain, but it was old, and it appeared to be connected to a container. The digging continued. The object was removed. The laboratory examined it. Inside was material that had survived decades underground. And among that material was something investigators recognized immediately: a piece of fabric. Its age was consistent with the disappearance. Its composition was consistent with clothing Samantha had been wearing. But the investigators needed more than consistency. They needed identification. The laboratory began testing. The result came back days later. The fabric contained biological material consistent with Samantha. The discovery transformed the investigation. For the first time, investigators had physical evidence connecting Samantha to the remote location. But there was still no complete answer. The suspect could claim someone else had moved the object. He could claim he had nothing to do with the burial. He could claim the evidence had been planted. Every possible defense had to be considered. Then investigators found another trace. This one was more powerful. A second DNA profile. The same profile found in the earlier evidence. The same profile associated with the suspect. The connection was becoming difficult to explain away. Yet the detectives did not stop. They searched the area again. A second excavation began. This time, the ground gave up something far more significant: human remains. The site went silent. The investigators stood back. The discovery had come after more than 20 years of uncertainty. For Samantha's family, the moment was devastating. They had spent decades living with the possibility that they might never know where she was. Now they finally knew. But knowing where she was did not answer every question. The remains were carefully recovered. Forensic specialists examined them. The identification was eventually confirmed. Samantha Eastman. The woman who had disappeared 20 years earlier was no longer officially missing. She was a homicide victim. The case had changed again. Now investigators could examine the remains for evidence of injury. They could determine whether trauma was present. They could establish an approximate cause of death. And the result would finally answer one of the oldest questions in the case. Samantha had not simply vanished. She had been killed. The evidence indicated violent trauma. The injuries were consistent with an assault. And suddenly, the old investigation made sense in a new way. The abandoned vehicle. The inconsistent timeline. The unexplained biological material. The suspect's changing statements. The remote property. The hidden remains. Piece by piece, the case was becoming a coherent story. But investigators still needed to establish motive. And motive was the part they understood least. Why Samantha? Why that night? Why had the suspect gone to such lengths to conceal what happened? The answer appeared in an old document. A document investigators had overlooked for years. Not a confession. Not a threat. Not a diary. A financial record. The document suggested Samantha had discovered something about the suspect's life that he desperately wanted hidden. The detectives followed the trail. They found evidence of a dispute. Money. Deception. A secret relationship. A fear that Samantha would expose him. The motive was not simple. It was not the kind of motive that fits neatly into a headline. It was a mixture of fear, anger, control, and desperation. Investigators believe Samantha had confronted him. She may have threatened to tell someone. He may have panicked. The argument escalated. And in a moment of violence, Samantha was killed. Then came the second crime. The concealment. The lies. The false alibi. The years of silence. For 20 years, the suspect had lived with the knowledge that Samantha's family did not know where she was. He had watched the investigation fade. He had watched the public forget. He had watched technology change. And he had believed that the evidence against him would never be strong enough. But now detectives had something he had not anticipated. Time had not destroyed the evidence. Time had preserved it. The old biological material had survived. The records had survived. The maps had survived. The statements had survived. And eventually Samantha herself had been found. The suspect was arrested. There was no dramatic chase.
No midnight ride. No gunfire.
Just a knock at the door. A warrant. Handcuffs. And a man who had spent more than 20 years believing the past would remain buried. When the news became public, the reaction was immediate. The woman whose photograph had once appeared on missing person posters was finally being spoken about again. Her name returned to television screens. Newspapers reopened the old story. People who had forgotten the case remembered where they had been when Samantha disappeared. For her family, however, the arrest brought conflicting emotions. Relief. Anger. Grief. And one painful realization. Justice had arrived late. Very late. 20 years is an extraordinary amount of time. Children grow up. Parents grow old. People move away. Entire neighborhoods change. But grief does not obey the calendar. For Samantha's family, every year without an answer had been another year suspended between hope and despair. Now, they had an answer. But an answer could not give them back the woman in the photograph. The trial would eventually force the evidence into public view. The prosecution would present the forensic connections. The old statements. The contradictory alibi. The discovery of the remains. The suspect's changing story. The defense would challenge every piece. They would argue that forensic evidence did not prove when contact occurred. They would question the reliability of old witnesses. They would challenge the timeline. They would insist that the case had been reconstructed decades after the fact. But the prosecution had something the original investigators never possessed. The pieces now connected. Not one clue. Not one witness. Not one forensic result.
A chain.
And the chain led back to one man. The man who had once denied knowing Samantha. The man who later admitted knowing her. The man whose DNA appeared in evidence. The man whose alibi had fractured. The man whose connection to the burial site could no longer be explained away. And finally, the man who had been silent while an entire family waited for answers. More than 20 years after Samantha Eastman disappeared, the cold case was no longer cold. The question was no longer who had killed her. The question was whether the courtroom would believe what the evidence was saying. And for the first time since that terrible night, Samantha's story was moving toward an ending. More than 20 years later, the killer in the flight attendant murder is finally caught. The Murder of Samantha Eastman, Minnesota. Fictionalized crime documentary screenplay continued. The courtroom doors opened to a case that had already survived longer than most investigations ever do. 20 years had passed since Samantha Eastman's disappearance, yet the evidence now being presented was forcing the past into the present. People who had been children when Samantha vanished were adults now. Officers who had worked the original investigation had retired. Some had died. Some could no longer remember the smallest details of those first chaotic days. But the evidence remained. And inside the courtroom, the passage of time suddenly seemed less important than it had outside. The prosecution began with Samantha herself. Not the crime. Not the suspect. Samantha. A photograph was displayed before the jury. A young woman. A flight attendant. A daughter. A friend. A person with plans that would never be completed. The prosecutor described her final known hours carefully.
No exageración.
No theatrical language. Just a timeline built from records, witness statements, and evidence recovered decades later. Then came the disappearance. Then the abandoned vehicle. Then the years of silence. And finally, the evidence that brought the case back to life. The defense listened without interruption. They knew the prosecution had a difficult burden. The suspect was not accused of a crime committed yesterday. He was accused of a murder that had remained unresolved for more than 2 decades. Memories had faded. Records had disappeared. Evidence had aged. And some witnesses could no longer be certain about what they remembered. The defense would use every weakness. That was expected. The first forensic witness took the stand. The laboratory specialist explained the DNA evidence. The jury heard technical language that meant little to most people outside a courtroom. Profiles. Alleles. Probabilities. Contamination controls. Testing protocols. Chain of custody. The specialist explained how biological material recovered during the original investigation had been preserved. How modern testing had extracted information from evidence that earlier technology could not fully analyze. How the resulting profile was compared with a known sample associated with the defendant. The numbers were presented carefully. The probability of a coincidental match was extraordinarily small. But the defense immediately attacked the conclusion. Could the biological material have been transferred? Could it have been deposited before Samantha's death? Could contamination have occurred? Could investigators have mishandled the evidence decades earlier? The laboratory specialist acknowledged that no forensic test existed in isolation from the circumstances surrounding it. That answer mattered. The prosecution did not need the DNA to tell the entire story. It needed the DNA to support the story told by everything else. The next witness was an investigator from the reopened cold case unit. He had not worked the original case. That distinction was important. He had inherited the file. He described the condition in which he found it. Boxes.
Reports.
Photographs. Old interview recordings. Evidence logs.
Names. Dates.
Unanswered questions. He explained that reopening the case did not mean assuming the original detectives had failed. It meant asking questions that could not have been answered 20 years earlier. Technology had changed. Investigative methods had changed. Forensic databases had expanded. And the evidence deserved another look. Then the prosecutor asked about the defendant's original statement. The old recording was played. The defendant's younger voice filled the courtroom. He denied knowing Samantha well. He denied seeing her that night. He denied being inside her vehicle. The jury listened. Then the prosecutor played excerpts from the later interview. The voice was older. Slower. But the answers were different. Now he admitted knowing Samantha. He admitted seeing her. He admitted speaking with her. The prosecutor paused, then asked the investigator what had caused the change. The answer was simple: evidence. The courtroom grew quiet, because the most powerful part of the prosecution's case was not one dramatic revelation. It was the accumulation. A lie from 20 years earlier. A biological trace. A contradictory alibi. A witness whose memory had changed. A hidden location. Human remains. And a second forensic connection. The defense argued that these pieces could be interpreted differently. The defendant had known Samantha. That did not make him a murderer. His DNA had been found in connection with evidence. That did not automatically establish when the contact occurred. He had lied. People lie for many reasons. And the remote property? The defense suggested that the connection was circumstantial. They questioned whether the defendant had exclusive access to the area. They argued that investigators had searched the land decades later under assumptions created by the reopened investigation. Every argument had the same purpose: create doubt. Because the defense did not have to prove what happened. It only had to make the jury uncertain enough that the prosecution could not prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. The case therefore turned toward the timeline. The final hours. The prosecutor reconstructed Samantha's movements. One location. Then another. A phone call. A meeting. The vehicle. The final confirmed sighting. Then the unexplained gap. The defendant's movements were placed beside hers. At first, the two timelines appeared separate. Then they converged. A short period. A narrow window. A period in which Samantha disappeared. A period in which the defendant's original alibi placed him somewhere else. And a period in which later evidence suggested he had actually been near Samantha. The defense attempted to widen the window. If Samantha could have disappeared earlier, they argued, then the defendant's movements became less significant. But the prosecution had another piece of evidence. A phone record. Old technology. Simple data. A call placed during a period that investigators had originally misunderstood. The location information was not precise enough to provide a street address. But it placed the phone within a broad area. The defendant had said he was elsewhere. The record suggested otherwise. The defense challenged the reliability of historical cellular data. The prosecution acknowledged its limitations. Again, the case depended not on one perfect clue, but on convergence. The evidence kept pointing in the same direction. Then came the witness who had supported the defendant's original alibi. An older man entered the courtroom slowly. His memory was not perfect. He admitted that. He could not remember every conversation from 20 years earlier. He could not remember every hour of that particular night. But when shown his original statement, he recognized his own words. The prosecutor asked whether the defendant had been with him during the critical period. The witness hesitated, then shook his head.
No.
The prosecutor asked why his original statement had said otherwise. The witness looked toward the defendant. He explained that he had been trying to help him. He had assumed the defendant needed an alibi.
He had not known why.
He had never imagined that the reason could be murder. The courtroom became silent. That statement did not prove Samantha's death, but it damaged the defendant's credibility. The man who had once provided the protection of an alibi was now explaining that the alibi had been false. The defense tried to discredit him. They pointed to the passage of time. They emphasized his uncertainty. They asked whether he could be mistaken. He admitted he could. But he maintained that the original statement had not been accurate. The prosecution then returned to the defendant's own words. During the later interview, he had described a conversation with Samantha. He had described an argument. He had described leaving. But his account had changed repeatedly regarding what happened afterward. At one point, he said Samantha was alive. At another, he said he could not remember. Then, he suggested she might have left the area on her own. The prosecutor asked the cold case investigator whether those contradictions mattered. The investigator answered carefully. They mattered because the defendant was the person who had placed himself with Samantha during the critical period. The jury now had a difficult choice. They had to decide whether these inconsistencies were signs of guilt or simply the confused recollections of a man being questioned about events more than 20 years old. The prosecution's next witness was the forensic pathologist. The remains recovered from the remote property were identified as Samantha's. The examination revealed evidence of significant trauma. The pathologist explained the limitations of examining remains after such a long period underground. Some injuries could no longer be reconstructed perfectly. Some evidence had been lost to time. But the pattern of damage was consistent with a violent death. The defense questioned whether the injuries could have been caused by an accident. The pathologist disagreed. The findings were inconsistent with a simple accident. Samantha had died violently. The prosecution then asked whether the remains could have been placed at the site after her death elsewhere. Yes. That was possible. But the evidence surrounding the location suggested deliberate concealment. The defendant's connection to the area therefore became crucial. Investigators had found no definitive proof that he alone controlled the property. But historical records showed that he had access to the area. Witnesses placed him nearby. And forensic evidence connected him to material associated with Samantha. The defense called its own experts. They challenged the DNA interpretation. They questioned the age of the biological material. They questioned whether the evidence could establish the exact sequence of events. They emphasized that forensic science could identify a person, but could not automatically reconstruct an entire crime. That was true. DNA could say who left biological material. It could not always say why. Or when. Or under what circumstances. The prosecution knew that. So, they returned to the larger picture. The suspect had known Samantha. He had lied about knowing her. He had lied about seeing her. His alibi was false. His biological material was connected to evidence. Samantha's remains were discovered at a location connected to him. And his later statements repeatedly changed when confronted with evidence. The prosecution argued that these facts were not isolated coincidences. They were pieces of one story. The defense argued that the story had been constructed backward. That investigators had found the suspect first, and then interpreted every old detail through the lens of guilt. It was a powerful argument. Cold case investigations always carry that danger. When investigators know the ending they're searching for, old evidence can appear different. A meaningless detail can suddenly look significant. An innocent contradiction can appear sinister. A forgotten witness can become central. The jury had to guard against that. The judge reminded them that suspicion was not enough. The prosecution had to prove the crime. The courtroom entered its final stage. Closing arguments. The prosecutor stood before the jury and spoke about time. 20 years. 20 years in which Samantha's family had lived without an answer. 20 years in which the defendant had lived without being held accountable. But the prosecutor did not ask the jury to convict because the family deserved closure. Closure was not evidence. Emotion was not proof. Instead, the prosecutor pointed to the chain. A chain that began with a lie. A chain that continued through forensic evidence. A chain that led to the hidden remains. A chain that returned to the defendant. The defense stood afterward. Their message was shorter. They reminded the jury that the prosecution's case was circumstantial. They reminded them that no eyewitness had seen Samantha being killed. There was no recording of the murder.
No confession.
No weapon conclusively tied to the defendant. No single piece of evidence that independently answered every question. They asked the jury to consider uncertainty. Then the jury left. The defendant remained seated. His family sat behind him. Samantha's family sat on the opposite side of the courtroom. For hours, nobody knew what the verdict would be. The courtroom emptied. Hallways became quiet. The old case had reached the moment that investigators had imagined for years. But for Samantha's family, there was no celebration. Only waiting. Again. Just as they had waited 20 years ago. Only now the waiting was measured in hours instead of decades. Then the doors opened. The jury returned. Everyone stood. The foreperson held the verdict. The judge asked for the decision. The defendant stared straight ahead. The clerk began to read.
Guilty.
The word seemed almost too small for the weight it carried.
Guilty.
20 years after Samantha disappeared, the man who had spent decades denying involvement was finally held responsible for her death. There was no dramatic reaction from Samantha's family. One person closed their eyes. Another lowered their head. Someone reached across the aisle and held a hand. That was all. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Cameras waited. Microphones were raised. Questions came quickly. How did it feel? Did the family finally have closure? Why did it take 20 years? What went wrong in the original investigation? But the family did not speak immediately. Because a verdict could establish responsibility. It could not erase 20 years. It could not restore Samantha. It could not return the person she had been before that final night. And perhaps that was the most haunting part of the entire case. The investigation had finally answered who. It had answered where. It had answered in broad terms what happened. But some questions would remain forever. What was Samantha thinking during her final moments? Did she know she was in danger? Did she trust the person sitting beside her? Did she realize that the ordinary conversation she had agreed to would become the last conversation of her life? No investigator could answer those questions. No courtroom could. No forensic laboratory could recover them. Those moments belonged to Samantha alone. The case that had once seemed impossible had finally reached a verdict. But the story did not end when the courtroom emptied. Because outside, another question remained. How had a murder remained unsolved for more than 20 years when the evidence that eventually broke the case had been sitting in storage almost from the beginning? The answer was complicated. It was not simply failure. It was time. Technology. Limited resources. Incomplete information. Human memory. And the brutal reality that investigators in the early years were working with the tools available to them. They had preserved evidence. That decision mattered. Because preservation gave the future a chance. The detectives who first handled Samantha's disappearance could not know what forensic science would become. They could not know that decades later, laboratories would extract information from evidence that once seemed useless. They could not know that databases would expand. They could not know that a cold case team would eventually look at the same photographs, the same statements, and the same evidence from a completely different perspective. But they preserved it. And because they did, Samantha's case remained alive. Not loudly. Not publicly.
Quietly.
Waiting. For 20 years, the killer believed the darkness was permanent. It wasn't. The darkness had simply been hiding the evidence. And eventually, the evidence found a way back into the light. The verdict was over, but the case continued to live in the minds of the people who had followed it. For the investigators, the arrest and conviction represented the end of one investigation and the beginning of another kind of reckoning. Every cold case, leaves behind questions that a verdict cannot answer. Why did the first leads fail? Why did certain witnesses remain uncertain? Why did the killer remain free for so long? And perhaps the most painful question of all, could Samantha have been saved if someone had noticed one more detail, asked one more question, followed one more road? Those questions had no simple answers. The original investigators had worked without the technology that eventually changed the case. They had relied on interviews, photographs, physical evidence, handwritten notes, telephone records that were far less detailed than modern systems, and forensic techniques that could not extract information from every trace left behind. They had searched. They had questioned. They had followed leads until those leads collapsed. And when the investigation stalled, the case entered a different world. Storage. Boxes. Evidence rooms. Cold shelves. Locked cabinets. A file number. Samantha's name became part of an archive. But the case was never truly forgotten. Her family refused to let it disappear. Every year brought the same private ritual. Another birthday. Another anniversary. Another reminder that Samantha remained forever 29 years old. The world continued changing around them. People who had known her aged. Children who had once asked why Samantha was gone became adults. New generations grew up without knowing her. That is what time does to an unsolved murder. It does not simply make the case older. It changes the people who remember it. The original photograph begins to look historical. The neighborhood where the victim lived no longer looks the same. The roads change. Businesses disappear. Buildings are demolished. The places where witnesses once stood become parking lots, apartment complexes, or empty fields. Eventually, even the landscape becomes evidence of how much time has passed. But the reopened investigation had done something important. It had separated memory from documentation. Instead of asking what people thought happened, investigators asked what the records actually showed. Instead of accepting old assumptions, they questioned them. Instead of treating the evidence as finished, they asked what modern science could do with it. That process uncovered a second layer beneath the original investigation. The first detectives had believed the murderer might have been a stranger. The reopened investigation increasingly suggested otherwise. Samantha had not simply encountered a random predator. She had been connected to the person responsible. That possibility explained the strange calm surrounding her final known movements. She had not behaved as if she were meeting a stranger. She had apparently agreed to meet someone she knew. That detail changed the emotional shape of the crime. It meant that the person responsible may have been able to approach her without triggering alarm. He did not need to force his way into her life. He was already there. That realization was devastating. Because murder does not always begin with a stranger appearing from the darkness. Sometimes it begins with trust. A familiar face. A familiar voice. A conversation that feels ordinary. A decision that seems harmless. Samantha could not have known where that decision would lead. The defendant's conviction established his responsibility in the fictionalized reconstruction of the case, but it did not erase the uncertainty surrounding his exact motive. The evidence suggested conflict.
Fear.
A secret he believed Samantha might expose. But motive in a homicide is rarely a single word. It is often a chain of emotions. Jealousy.
Panic.
Control.
Shame.
Anger. Desperation. One decision creates another. A confrontation becomes an argument. An argument becomes violence. Then comes the moment when a person realizes that everything has changed. The killer has a choice. Call for help. Tell the truth. Accept responsibility. Or conceal the crime. In Samantha's case, the evidence suggested that concealment won. That choice created 20 years of deception. 20 years of pretending. 20 years of watching people search for a woman whose killer already knew would never come home. That is what makes a cold case so psychologically disturbing. The victim is absent, but the killer may still be present. He may go to work. He may attend weddings. He may stand beside friends. He may sit at a family dinner. He may watch news reports about the investigation. He may hear Samantha's name spoken on television. And every time he hears it, he knows something nobody else knows. For years, that knowledge can become almost ordinary. The human mind can adapt to almost anything. A secret carried long enough can begin to feel like another part of life. The killer may eventually stop thinking about the crime every day. He may convince himself that nobody will ever know. He may even convince himself that he escaped. But evidence does not need to remember. Evidence only needs to survive. That was the central lesson of Samantha's case. The biological material survived. The photographs survived. The original interview survived. The record survived. The map survived. And eventually, the remains were found. Time had not destroyed the case. Time had simply delayed the moment when investigators could understand it. The forensic developments were especially significant. Modern DNA analysis did not create evidence that had never existed. It gave investigators the ability to interpret evidence that had already been collected. That distinction matters. The original investigators had preserved pieces of Samantha's final hours. They did not know which pieces would become important. Decades later, another generation of investigators could examine them with new tools. This is one reason cold case detectives rarely stop looking at old evidence. Science changes. Databases grow. Testing methods improve. A sample that once produced nothing can sometimes produce information years later. A fingerprint once considered too incomplete can become useful after better comparison technology develops. A photograph can reveal details invisible to investigators decades earlier. A digital record can reconstruct movements that witnesses no longer remember. The past does not remain scientifically frozen. It can be re-examined. And sometimes it speaks differently. Samantha's case became an example of that principle. The evidence had been quiet. Then the laboratory made it loud. But for the family, the science was never the point. They wanted Samantha's story remembered. Not only as a murder victim. Not only as a photograph. Not only as a name attached to a cold case file. They wanted people to remember the person behind the headline. The young woman who had plans. The coworker who laughed. The daughter whose absence changed an entire family. The friend whose messages stopped. The flight attendant who once moved through airports surrounded by strangers and coworkers, never knowing that one day her own disappearance would become a mystery studied for decades. The title of the case might always be the same. Flight attendant murdered. Cold case solved. Killer arrested after 20 years. But headlines compress lives. They turn people into phrases. Samantha deserved more than a headline. Her family understood that. So after the trial, they returned to the photograph. The same photograph investigators had used in the first search. The same face that had appeared on posters. The same eyes that had stared out from newspapers. Only now there was a difference. There was no longer a question mark beside her name. She had been found. Her killer had been identified. The case had a conclusion. It was painful. It was imperfect. But it was an answer. For the first time in more than 20 years, Samantha's family could speak about her without having to say the words missing person. She was not missing anymore. She was remembered. That distinction may sound small. It is not. For families of the missing, the absence of certainty can become its own form of suffering. There is no funeral.
No grave.
No confirmed final moment. Only possibility. Maybe she is alive. Maybe she is somewhere else. Maybe someone will call. Maybe someone will remember something. Maybe tomorrow will bring the answer. And tomorrow becomes another year. Then another. Eventually, hope becomes inseparable from grief. Finding Samantha ended that particular uncertainty. But it also created a new pain. The family now knew what they had spent decades fearing. The woman they loved was never coming home. That truth can be both devastating and strangely liberating. Because grief requires reality. The family could finally mourn Samantha instead of searching for her. They could finally say goodbye. Not to a photograph. Not to a memory. But to a person whose fate had finally been established. The conviction also changed the way the community remembered the case. People who had once described Samantha's disappearance as a mystery now spoke about it as a solved murder. The old newspaper stories became historical documents. The abandoned vehicle became part of the timeline. The remote property became a place associated forever with the crime. And the evidence box that had once seemed insignificant became symbolic. It represented something larger than Samantha's case. It represented the possibility that no cold case is completely silent. Sometimes the answer is already sitting somewhere, waiting for someone to ask a better question. That idea would eventually become part of the training discussions surrounding the fictionalized investigation. Cold case detectives often face an impossible task. They must respect the original investigation while challenging its assumptions. They must avoid hindsight. They must resist the temptation to believe that every unexplained detail is a clue. They must separate coincidence from connection. And they must remember that evidence can point in different directions. The successful reopening of a case does not begin with certainty. It begins with curiosity. What if the original timeline was wrong? What if the witness remembered a different detail? What if the evidence was tested again? What if the person investigators ruled out decades ago was never actually ruled out? What if the answer was present all along? Those questions can transform a dead file into an active investigation. But they can also create danger. A cold case can destroy reputations if investigators move too quickly. An innocent person can become suspicious simply because their name appears in an old report. A witness can be misremembered. A forensic result can be misunderstood. That is why the reopened investigation had to proceed slowly. Every conclusion required support. Every theory had to survive scrutiny. The investigators could not simply decide who the killer was. They had to prove it. And eventually, the evidence did. Not through one dramatic clue. Through accumulation. That is often how real investigations end. Not with a single revelation. With dozens of small truths finally pointing in the same direction. A statement. A record. A trace. A location. A contradiction. A laboratory result. A buried secret. One by one, they become impossible to ignore. The defendant had once believed that time was his ally. It was not. Time had changed the world around him. But it had also changed the tools investigators could use against him. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more advanced those tools became. 20 years earlier, the evidence had been limited. 20 years later, it had become enough. That irony was impossible to miss. The passage of time had helped the killer hide. Then the same passage of time helped expose him. And somewhere beneath all of that was the simplest fact. Samantha was still there. In the evidence. In the records. In the memories of the people who loved her. Waiting to be found. Waiting to be named. Waiting for someone to look at the old case and refuse to accept that silence was the same thing as an answer. The murder had remained unresolved for years. But unresolved did not mean forgotten. The case had survived. And so had Samantha's story. Long after the headlines disappeared, long after the original detectives left the department, long after the landscape around the crime had changed, the question remained. Who did this? The answer eventually came. But it came slowly. It came through science, through persistence, through evidence that refused to disappear, and through investigators willing to reopen a file everyone else believed belonged to the past. That is why the final image of the case is not the courtroom. It is not the handcuffs. It is not the guilty verdict. It is the evidence room. A box on a shelf. A name written across its side. Samantha Eastman. 20 years of dust above it. 20 years of silence around it. And inside, the smallest traces of a truth that had never actually disappeared. The killer had walked away. The witnesses had forgotten. The newspapers had moved on. The town had changed. But the evidence waited. And eventually someone came looking. The evidence room was quiet again after the case was solved. There were no reporters there.
No cameras.
No courtroom audience. Just shelves, locked cabinets, sealed bags, and boxes carrying the names of people whose stories had once filled entire police departments with urgency. Most would never be opened again. Some would remain forgotten for decades. But one box had already changed everything. The Samantha Eastman file had proved that a case could sleep for years without truly dying. It had proved that silence was not the same thing as disappearance. And it had proved something investigators sometimes learn only after years of experience. The smallest piece of evidence can become the most important piece when the right question is finally asked. For the detectives who reopened Samantha's case, the work did not end with the conviction. They returned to the original file. Again. This time, they were not searching for a killer. They were searching for everything they had learned about Samantha. The photographs were placed beside the modern forensic reports. The old witness statements were compared with the later interviews. The original timeline was placed beside the reconstructed timeline. The differences were striking. 20 years had changed the meaning of certain details. A statement that once seemed insignificant now appeared important. A location that had once seemed irrelevant had become central. A biological trace that had once produced no usable information had become one of the strongest links in the investigation. The case had effectively been solved twice. First, investigators had discovered that Samantha had been murdered. Then, decades later, they discovered who had done it. But there was another layer. Why had the original investigation stalled? The answer was not one mistake. It was a combination of circumstances. The crime scene had never been perfectly defined. Samantha's body had not been found. The killer had apparently taken steps to conceal evidence. The suspect had provided an alibi. Witnesses had incomplete memories. And the technology available at the time could not fully interpret the biological evidence. The investigation had reached the edge of what investigators could prove. Then the case stopped moving. That distinction mattered. A cold case is not always a case nobody cares about. Sometimes it is a case where investigators have exhausted every available path. The detectives had followed the evidence as far as it went. Then the evidence stopped. Decades later, the road opened again. The new team had something their predecessors did not. Distance. They were not emotionally trapped inside the original assumptions. They could examine the case without remembering the pressure of the first days. They could ask why a witness had been believed, why another had been dismissed, why one location had been searched and another had not. They could challenge every conclusion without insulting the people who had made it. That was crucial. Cold case investigations are built on an uncomfortable balance. Respect the past. Question the past. Both are necessary. The detectives who first worked Samantha's disappearance had been facing an active crisis. A woman was missing. Her family wanted answers. The public wanted answers. Every hour mattered. The reopened team had something different.
Time.
They could spend weeks analyzing one document. They could examine maps from different years. They could compare historical property boundaries. They could search records that did not exist when Samantha disappeared. And they could ask questions of technology that earlier investigators could not even imagine asking. One of those technologies was genetic genealogy. In the fictionalized reconstruction of the case, the forensic team did not simply compare a DNA sample to one known suspect. They examined the unidentified profile through a broader genetic framework. Connections could reveal distant relationships, family lines, possible relatives, generational patterns. The process did not immediately name a murderer. It narrowed a world of possibilities. That distinction is important. Modern forensic science does not magically produce a suspect. It produces information. Investigators still have to interpret it. They still have to verify identities. They still have to establish timelines. They still have to determine whether a person connected genetically to evidence was actually connected to the crime. In Samantha's case, the technology provided another reason to look closely at a man investigators had previously considered only peripherally. Then the old interview became important. His words were preserved. His denials were preserved. The investigators could compare what he had said when he believed nobody could connect him to Samantha with what the evidence showed decades later. The contradiction was no longer theoretical. It was recorded. His own voice became evidence. That may have been one of the most unsettling elements of the entire case. The past had preserved his story. The future had preserved the evidence. Eventually, the two collided. There was another detail that investigators found disturbing. The suspect had followed news of Samantha's disappearance. That alone meant little. Anyone in the community could have followed the case. But investigators discovered that he had known details that had never been publicly released. Details from inside the investigation. Information about evidence. Information about Samantha's movements. Information that only certain people could have known. Again, it was not enough by itself. But it became another piece of the chain. The detectives returned to the original interview. Why had he known those details? His explanation changed. First, he said someone must have told him. Then he said he had heard rumors. Then he said he could not remember. 3 explanations. None stable. The investigators now had a pattern. Whenever evidence moved closer to him, his memory became less certain. Whenever investigators asked about Samantha, his story changed. That did not automatically make him guilty. But it made his credibility increasingly difficult to defend. The final interview was therefore less about forcing a confession and more about allowing the suspect to explain himself. That distinction mattered. Investigators did not need him to admit the murder if the evidence already established it. They needed to give him the opportunity to tell the truth. He did not. Instead, he returned to the same basic explanation. He had known Samantha. He had seen her. They had argued. But he claimed he had not killed her. The detectives asked where she had gone afterward. He said he did not know. They asked why his DNA was connected to evidence. He said he could not explain it. They asked why his alibi was false. He said he had been afraid. Afraid of what? He would not say. Then the detective placed Samantha's photograph in front of him. Again. The room became silent. This time, the detective did not ask whether he knew her. He asked one final question. Do you remember the last thing she said to you? The suspect looked at the photograph. He did not answer immediately. Then he whispered something. The recording captured it. A sentence. A fragment. Not a confession. but a detail that investigators believed only someone present during Samantha's final moments could have known. The interview ended shortly afterward. The evidence was enough. The arrest followed. But the case had one more surprise. Investigators discovered that the suspect had kept an object connected to Samantha for years. Not because he wanted to remember her. Not because he was sentimental. Because he had never completely destroyed the evidence. It had been hidden among ordinary belongings. A small object. Almost worthless. Something nobody would notice. Yet it carried significance because Samantha had possessed it shortly before she disappeared. Testing established a connection. Another link. Another thread. Another piece of the chain. By then, the investigators no longer needed a confession. They had something stronger. A coherent narrative supported by independent evidence. That is what ultimately separates suspicion from proof. A suspect can lie. A witness can forget. A memory can fail. A theory can collapse. But when separate forms of evidence point toward the same conclusion, the probability of coincidence becomes increasingly difficult to defend. That was what happened in Samantha's case. The evidence did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. Slowly. Patiently. Almost invisibly. The case had been built from fragments. Now the fragments formed a picture. Samantha had met someone she knew. An argument had occurred. Violence followed. Her body was concealed. Her vehicle was abandoned. The killer created an alibi. Then he remained silent. For years. The most disturbing part was how ordinary life continued around the secret. People went to work. Children went to school. Cars traveled the roads. Planes took off from airports. Flight attendants walked through terminals carrying luggage and schedules. And Samantha was not there. Her absence existed inside all of that ordinary movement. Every airport became a reminder of the life she had once lived. Every flight attendant wearing a uniform could resemble the person people remembered. Every announcement over a loudspeaker could evoke the world Samantha had belonged to. That is how a missing person can remain present. Not physically. Emotionally. The family carried her through the years. They remembered her voice. Her habits. Her sense of humor. The little things that never appear in police reports. The case file could describe her final movements. It could document her disappearance. It could record her death. But it could never fully capture who she was. That is why cold case investigators sometimes say the victim is the center of the investigation. Not the suspect. Not the evidence. The victim. Everything begins with the question. Who was this person? What happened to them? Why did their life end? And how can the truth be restored? In Samantha's case, the answer took more than 20 years. That delay changed everyone involved. The original detectives grew older. The witnesses grew older. The family grew older. The suspect grew older. But Samantha remained exactly as she was on the last day anyone saw her alive. 29. Forever frozen in the photograph. That is one of the cruelest realities of homicide. The victim stops aging. Everyone else continues. For 2 decades, Samantha's family had lived with that imbalance. Now, they could finally begin to move forward. Not because the pain disappeared. It did not. But because uncertainty had ended. There was a grave. There was a name. There was a verdict. There was accountability. And there was finally a place where the family could go and say goodbye. The location where Samantha's remains were recovered became more than a crime scene. It became part of her final chapter. Investigators returned once more after the trial. The area looked different in daylight. Quiet. ordinary, almost peaceful. That was perhaps the strangest thing. There was nothing about the landscape that announced what had happened there. No warning. No sign.
No visible scar.
Just trees. Earth.
Wind.
The ordinary sounds of nature. The investigators stood there and thought about how many people had passed nearby without knowing. How many years the secret had remained underground. How many times the killer had driven past without believing anyone would ever find her. But the ground had kept its secret only temporarily. Eventually, science caught up. The final chapter of Samantha's story was not about revenge. It was about recognition. She had been missing. Then she was found. She had been unidentified. Then she was named. Her death had been unexplained. Then it was investigated. Her killer had been unknown. Then he was arrested. The case had once seemed destined to remain unresolved. It did not. And that is why cold cases matter. Because the passage of time does not erase a crime. It only changes the shape of the investigation. Evidence can survive. Families can persist. Technology can advance. New detectives can ask old questions. And sometimes, decades after everyone else has stopped looking, the truth is still there. Waiting. Samantha's case had been buried beneath years of silence. But silence is fragile. One laboratory result can break it. One witness can remember. One investigator can reopen a file. One question can change everything. And somewhere inside the evidence room, beneath layers of dust and decades of paperwork, the truth had been waiting for precisely that moment. The moment someone decided that 20 years was not the end. It was only the amount of time it took to find the beginning. For Samantha's family, the years after the conviction did not suddenly become easy. There was no morning when they woke up and discovered that grief had vanished. There was no sentence from a judge powerful enough to return the years stolen from them. A verdict could identify a killer. It could not restore a daughter. It could not recreate a voice. It could not return the ordinary moments that had disappeared with Samantha when her life was cut short. What the verdict gave them was something different. Certainty. After more than 2 decades of questions, there was finally a factual answer to the question that had followed them everywhere. Samantha had been murdered. Her remains had been found. The person responsible had been convicted. And for the first time, her family could stop wondering whether the phone might ring. The case also left behind a question that investigators continued to examine long after the courtroom emptied. How had the truth remained hidden for so long? The answer was uncomfortable. Because sometimes a killer does not need to be brilliant. He only needs to survive the uncertainty created by time. A missing woman can generate thousands of possibilities. A stranger. A former partner. A coworker. A random criminal. A voluntary disappearance. An accident. A misunderstanding. Investigators must consider all of them. That uncertainty gives a guilty person something extraordinarily valuable. Noise. Too many possibilities. Too many names. Too many directions. The original investigation had been flooded with information. Some of it useful. Much of it useless. And somewhere inside that noise, the killer had remained. The reopened investigation worked differently. It reduced the noise. Instead of asking everyone who could possibly have known Samantha, detectives asked a narrower question. Who had access? Who had opportunity? Who had a reason to lie? Who appeared in the timeline when Samantha disappeared? Who had information they should not have possessed? Who was connected to the physical evidence? Those questions gradually compressed the investigation. The circle became smaller. Then smaller again. Eventually, it became one person. That process was not dramatic. There was no single moment when a detective suddenly shouted that they had found the killer. The truth emerged slowly. A record here. A contradiction there. A forensic result. An old statement. A forgotten location. A piece of evidence preserved for years. Cold cases are often solved that way. Not with a lightning strike. With pressure. The pressure of evidence accumulating until the original explanation can no longer survive. The defendant had spent decades relying on ambiguity. Now ambiguity was disappearing. His old story had depended on Samantha being missing. As long as her remains were not found, there was no definitive crime scene. As long as there was no crime scene, there was room for alternative explanations. As long as the timeline remained uncertain, there was room for an alibi. As long as the forensic evidence remained incomplete, there was room for denial. But every discovery removed one escape route. The recovery of Samantha's remains eliminated the possibility that she had simply disappeared voluntarily. The forensic examination established violent death. The evidence connected the defendant to material associated with Samantha. The historical records damaged his alibi. His own statements changed. The remote location became significant. The case was no longer built around what might have happened. It was built around what the evidence demonstrated. That distinction was the difference between a mystery and a prosecution. The investigators also revisited the people Samantha had trusted. That part of the case was painful. Some relationships had been misunderstood. Some people who initially appeared suspicious turned out to have completely innocent explanations. One person had seemed evasive during the original investigation. Decades later, investigators discovered that the person had been hiding an unrelated personal problem. Another witness had given an inconsistent account because they had been afraid of becoming involved. Another had simply remembered the wrong date. The reopened investigation cleared several people who had carried suspicion for years. That mattered. Solving a cold case is not only about identifying the guilty. It is also about identifying the innocent. Every wrong accusation leaves another wound. Every name incorrectly attached to a murder can damage a life. The investigators understood that. They moved carefully. The defendant was not convicted because he looked suspicious. He was convicted because the evidence formed a pattern that survived examination. That pattern also changed the public understanding of Samantha's disappearance. For years, some people had believed she might have left willingly. Others imagined a stranger. Others believed she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The truth was more disturbing. She had known the person who killed her. That meant the final hours of her life may have appeared ordinary. There may have been no alarm. No obvious warning. No reason for Samantha to believe she was walking toward danger. This is what made the case linger in the community. People began remembering their own encounters with strangers. Co-workers. Neighbors. Former friends. People they trusted. The murder forced an uncomfortable realization. Danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it looks familiar. Sometimes it speaks in a voice you recognize. Sometimes the final decision a victim makes is one that appears completely ordinary. That does not make the victim responsible. It makes the crime more tragic. Samantha could not have known what was coming. The responsibility belonged entirely to the person who chose violence. That point became important when the case was discussed publicly. The story was not about a mistake Samantha made. It was about a choice her killer made. A choice followed by another. And another. He chose violence. Then he chose concealment. Then he chose deception. Then he chose silence. And every year that passed became another decision to remain silent. 20 years. That is more than 7,000 days. More than 240 months. Thousands of mornings. Thousands of nights. every one of them another opportunity to tell the truth. He did not. Instead, the secret became part of his life. The investigators wondered whether he ever believed the case would return. Perhaps he thought the evidence had disappeared. Perhaps he believed the family would eventually stop asking questions. Perhaps he believed the original investigation had reached its limit. Perhaps he believed 20 years was enough. He was wrong. The case returned because people refused to accept that an unanswered question was the same as an unsolvable question. That difference is fundamental. Unsolved does not mean unsolvable. It means unresolved. There is a future in that word. A possibility. A door that has not completely closed. That is why cold case units continue to exist. Some cases may never be solved. Some evidence may be lost. Some witnesses may disappear. Some perpetrators may die before justice arrives. But others remain within reach. Sometimes the missing piece is technological. Sometimes it is human. Sometimes a witness finally feels safe enough to speak. Sometimes a detective notices a contradiction. Sometimes a new database creates a connection that did not exist before. And sometimes the evidence was always there. Samantha's case contained all of those elements. The original investigators had preserved the physical evidence. The family had preserved the memory. The reopened detectives preserved the questions. And modern forensic science supplied another way to examine the answers. After the conviction, investigators conducted one final review of the evidence. They wanted to know whether anything else had been missed. They examined the old photographs again. The crime scene images. The vehicle. The clothing. The surrounding area. The original search records. They discovered no new evidence that changed the verdict. But they found something else. A reminder of how difficult the original investigation had been. In one photograph, the abandoned vehicle appeared almost ordinary. That image had been taken shortly after Samantha disappeared. There was nothing visibly dramatic about it. No obvious sign that a murder had occurred. And yet, decades later, investigators knew that the vehicle represented one of the final links to Samantha's life. She had been there. The killer had been connected to her. And then she was gone. The photograph became one of the most important images in the entire case precisely because it looked so ordinary. Crime scenes do not always look like crime scenes. That is one of the hardest lessons for investigators. Violence can leave obvious destruction. But it can also leave almost nothing visible. A closed door. A parked vehicle. An empty room. A phone that stops receiving calls. A schedule that is suddenly broken. The absence itself becomes evidence. Samantha's disappearance began with that absence. And the investigation ended by explaining it. The community also began remembering Samantha differently. Not as the woman who vanished. As the woman who had lived. People searched old photographs. Former coworkers shared memories. Friends remembered conversations. Stories emerged that had never appeared in police reports because they had never seemed relevant to the investigation. Someone remembered Samantha's laugh. Someone remembered how she prepared for flights. Someone remembered that she hated being late. Someone remembered a favorite song. Someone remembered the way she used to greet people. These details did not solve the murder. But they restored something the case file could never provide. A human identity. Because when someone becomes the subject of a homicide investigation, there is a danger that the crime can consume the person. The victim becomes evidence. The victim becomes a photograph. The victim becomes a case number. The victim becomes a headline. But Samantha had been a complete person before she became a victim. She had dreams. Habits. Friends. Plans. A future. That future was taken. The conviction could not restore it. But remembering her could restore part of her presence. And so, years after the verdict, her name continued to be spoken. Not because another mystery had emerged. Because the mystery had finally been answered. That is the strange legacy of a solved cold case. The ending becomes a beginning. Families begin to grieve openly. Investigators begin to understand what happened. Communities begin to remember. And other cold case detectives look at the file and ask whether their own unsolved cases might contain similar possibilities. The Samantha Eastman investigation became a reminder that evidence should be preserved even when an answer seems impossible. A biological trace that cannot be tested today may be testable tomorrow. A damaged record may be recoverable. A forgotten witness may remember something after years. A technology that does not yet exist may eventually become routine. The future can change the meaning of the past. That was the lesson left behind by Samantha's case. The killer had believed the past belonged to him. It did not. The past belonged to the evidence. And evidence has a strange kind of patience. It does not become tired. It does not lose interest. It does not forget. It waits. For the right technology. For the right investigator. For the right question. For the moment when someone decides to open the box again. More than 20 years after Samantha vanished, that moment finally arrived. And when it did, the silence surrounding her death began to break. First slowly. Then completely. The truth had not appeared from nowhere. It had been there all along. Buried in records. Preserved in evidence. Hidden beneath years of uncertainty. Waiting for someone to understand what it meant. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of Samantha Eastman's story. The killer did not defeat the investigation. He only outlived its first attempt. The second attempt was different. The second attempt had time. Technology. Distance. And evidence that had refused to disappear. For 20 years, the question had been whether Samantha would ever be found. Then the answer came. She was found. For 20 years, the question had been whether her killer would ever be identified. Then the evidence answered. He was. For 20 years, the family had asked whether justice would ever come. It came late. But it came. And when the final door closed behind the convicted killer, Samantha's case was no longer a mystery. It was history. A history written in evidence. A history written in grief. A history written in the memory of a woman whose life ended far too soon. The last image remained the same photograph. Samantha looking into the camera. Young. Alive. Unaware. There is something almost unbearable about photographs like that. They capture a person before the tragedy. They preserve a moment that had no idea what was coming. For everyone who knew Samantha, that photograph became more than evidence. It became a doorway to memory. And perhaps that is where her story should remain. Not with the killer. Not with the courtroom. Not with the handcuffs. With Samantha. Because the final victory in a case like this is not simply putting someone behind bars. It is refusing to let the victim disappear. 20 years passed. The world changed. The evidence changed. The investigation changed. But Samantha's name remained. And as long as someone remembers the woman behind that name, the killer never gets the final word.